Sometimes the greatest mistake a man can make is believing he already knows the face of his future. Elias Carter had spent 34 years learning not to expect much from life. Out on the dry Wyoming frontier, hope had a way of disappearing faster than rain on summer dust. His ranch stretched across nearly 200 acres of stubborn earth where every fence post leaned a little. Every barn board carried the scars of hard winters, and every sunrise demanded another day's work before offering any reward. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush across the valley while leather creaked beneath his saddle, and the distant lowing of cattle echoed through the cool morning air. People in the nearby town often called him dependable, though none of them would have mistaken that word for happy. They knew he kept to himself, attended church when the weather allowed, paid every debt on time, and rarely smiled long enough for anyone to remember it. So when word spread that Elias had agreed to marry a woman he had never met, every porch and every general store filled with whispers before breakfast was over. Some said she was playing. Others claimed she came from a distant settlement with nothing to her name. A few insisted the arrangement had been made simply to settle an old agreement between families who no longer had anyone else left. Elias listened without correcting anyone because, truthfully, he had imagined much the same. He wasn't searching for romance. He only hoped for peace. A quiet home. A partner willing to share long winters and longer harvests. Beauty had never seemed important. Kindness mattered more. Steadiness mattered more. Yet somewhere deep inside, a small part of him still pictured an ordinary bride stepping down from the stagecoach with lowered eyes and a nervous smile. By mid-afternoon, the entire town gathered near the depot, pretending they had business to finish while secretly waiting for the same arrival. The old station clock clicked toward 3 as sunlight spilled across weathered planks and wagon wheels. Horses stomped patiently beside hitching posts, flicking their tails against persistent flies. Children chased one another through drifting clouds of dust until their mothers called them back. Then the stagecoach appeared beyond the ridge, rolling slowly toward town with iron-rimmed wheels humming against the packed earth. Every conversation faded. Every pair of eyes turned toward the road. Elias removed his hat without realizing it, his pulse suddenly louder than the squeak of leather harnesses. The coach stopped. The driver climbed down first. One weathered trunk followed, then another. Finally, the door opened. A woman stepped into the afternoon light with calm, deliberate grace. She wore no expensive dress, no sparkling jewelry, no fashionable ribbons. Instead, a carefully woven Apache shawl rested across her shoulders, and around her neck hung a turquoise pendant unlike anything the townspeople had ever seen. It was not large, yet something about it seemed to command silence. The breeze lifted a strand of her dark hair as she raised her eyes, neither fearful nor defiant, simply steady. The whispers stopped so completely that even the flutter of a distant flag sounded loud. Elias felt the world narrow to a single heartbeat. This was not the bride anyone had described. And before either of them spoke a single word, he sensed that the story everyone believed had already begun to unravel. Nobody moved for several long seconds. The silence felt heavier than the dust settling around the stagecoach wheels. Elias stepped forward first because he knew everyone was watching, yet the woman standing before him did not seem concerned with the curious eyes surrounding her. She simply reached into the small leather bag hanging from her shoulder and unfolded a neatly written document bearing the county seal. "My name is Nayeli," she said in a calm voice that carried without effort. "I believe we have a home to build together." There was no uncertainty in her words, no attempt to impress anyone, only quiet confidence. Elias accepted the paper, glanced over the signatures, then folded it carefully into his jacket pocket. "Welcome," he answered after a moment. It sounded awkward even to his own ears. She offered the slightest smile, one that appeared and disappeared like sunlight slipping through passing clouds. Behind them, whispers resumed. Some people looked surprised. Others looked disappointed that no argument had broken out. A few simply stared at the turquoise pendant resting against Nayeli's chest as though it belonged to another world. The ride back to the ranch took nearly an hour across winding dirt roads lined with sagebrush and scattered cottonwood trees. Leather reins creaked softly in Elias's hands while the wagon rolled over shallow ruts left by weeks without rain. Neither of them hurried to fill the silence. Elias searched for ordinary questions, but discovered that every sentence sounded too small. Finally, he cleared his throat. Have you ever lived on a ranch before? Nayeli watched a hawk circling high above the valley before answering. No, but I have lived where every sunrise decides whether a family eats. Elias nodded without speaking again. Somehow that answer carried more meaning than a long conversation ever could. As the ranch came into view, the afternoon light painted the weathered barn in warm gold while the old windmill turned with a tired groan. Nayeli climbed down from the wagon before Elias could offer his hand. She stood quietly for several moments, studying every fence, every pasture, every broken gate, as though reading a story written across the land itself. Most visitors noticed the house first. She noticed the dry creek bed beyond the north pasture. She noticed the sagging corner of the horse barn. She noticed birds avoiding one section of the field. Elias found himself wondering what she was seeing that he had overlooked after years of living there. Inside the house, everything was clean but simple. A pine table stood near the window. Cast iron pans hung beside the stove. His late mother's quilt rested neatly across the rocking chair. Nayeli removed her shawl with careful hands and looked around without touching anything. She loved this home, she said quietly. Elias turned toward her, surprised. You never met my mother. Nayeli gently traced the edge of the quilt with her eyes rather than her fingers. No, she replied. But people leave pieces of themselves behind when they care for a place. Your mother is still speaking. You have simply become used to her voice. Elias had no answer. Before he could gather his thoughts, a sharp knock echoed against the front door. 3 neighbors stood outside carrying fresh bread and polite smiles that did little to hide their curiosity. Their greetings were friendly enough, yet every question seemed directed only toward Elias, as though Nayeli were standing somewhere far away instead of beside him. She answered none of their uneasy glances with offense. She simply listened, thanked them for the bread, and wished them a safe ride home. As the last horse disappeared beyond the hill, Elias noticed something he could not explain. Throughout the entire afternoon, not once had Nayeli tried to prove she belonged there. Somehow, that quiet certainty made everyone else question whether they truly understood the meaning of belonging at all. Nearly 2 weeks passed before Elias realized that silence could have many different meanings. Some silences came from loneliness. Others came from pride. Nayeli's silence came from observation. Every morning, she stepped outside before sunrise while the sky still carried deep shades of blue. She stood facing the distant hills for several quiet moments before beginning the day, listening to birds that Elias had stopped noticing years ago and watching the wind ripple through tall grass as though it were carrying messages only she could understand. Elias followed the same routine he always had. He saddled the horses, repaired worn fences, checked the cattle, and measured each day by the number of chores completed before sunset. At first he believed they simply lived different lives beneath the same roof. Then small things began to change. One cool morning he reached the barn expecting to spend hours repairing a loose gate, only to discover it already standing straight and secure with fresh wooden pegs carved by hand. He assumed one of the neighbors had stopped by. Later that afternoon, he noticed the water buckets beside the horses remained cooler than usual despite the heat. The following day, several chickens wandered into a shaded corner that had somehow become more comfortable than the rest of the yard. Elias never saw Nayeli doing any of it. The improvements simply appeared one after another like quiet answers to questions he had never asked. Inside the house, their conversations remained brief but never cold. During supper, she asked about rainfall from previous summers. She wanted to know which pasture flooded first during spring and which hills held frost the longest in winter. Elias answered without understanding why such details mattered. She listened carefully, storing every word away with the patience of someone collecting pieces of a much larger picture. One evening she paused beside the old map hanging on the kitchen wall. Her finger hovered above a faded blue line that no longer matched the dry ground outside. Was there once a creek here? She asked softly. Elias nodded. When I was a boy it flowed almost year-round. It disappeared many years ago. Nayeli looked toward the western window where the last orange light settled across the valley. Water rarely disappears, she said. Sometimes it only chooses another path. Elias almost smiled at what sounded like a simple proverb, yet something in her voice suggested she was speaking from experience rather than hope. The next morning he rode into town for supplies. Inside the general store, several men greeted him with friendly laughter before one finally asked the question everyone had been holding back. "So how is married life treating you?" Elias shrugged. "Quiet." Another man chuckled. "Does she know anything about ranch work?" Elias hesitated longer than expected. He wanted to answer no because he had never seen her rope cattle or mend harnesses. Instead, another thought interrupted him. He remembered the repaired gate, the healthy horses, the cooler water, the calm order that had slowly settled across the property. "She notices things," he finally replied. The men exchanged puzzled looks before changing the subject. On the ride home, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of approaching rain, even though the sky remained perfectly clear. As Elias reached the crest overlooking his ranch, he spotted Nayeli standing beside the old windmill with one hand resting lightly against its weathered frame. She was watching a small flock of birds circle low over the northern pasture. When he asked what she was looking at, she answered without turning around. "Tomorrow they will not fly here anymore." Elias frowned and searched the empty field for an explanation. He found none. Yet something in the certainty of her voice lingered with him long after the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains, and for the first time since she had arrived, he began to wonder whether the greatest mystery living under his roof was not who Nayeli had been before she came, but what she could already see that everyone else had learned to overlook. The next morning the birds were gone. Elias noticed it before he even reached the pasture. The familiar chorus that usually greeted the sunrise had been replaced by an uneasy stillness that settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Even the horses seemed quieter, lifting their heads toward the northern hills before returning to half-finished bundles of hay. He remembered Nayeli's words from the evening before and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. By noon the sky had turned pale and empty, the kind of washed-out blue that promised no clouds and no mercy. The wind carried dry dust instead of the scent of damp earth, and every step across the pasture released tiny cracks beneath his boots. Elias spent hours checking fences and watering troughs, only to discover that one of the shallow ponds had dropped several inches overnight. It made no sense. There had been no unusual heat, no strong winds, nothing that should have changed the land so quickly. Yet the ranch looked tired. The grass had already begun losing its deep green color, and several calves wandered farther than usual searching for fresh patches to graze. When Elias returned to the house near sunset, he found Nayeli kneeling beside the kitchen table with several smooth stones arranged in careful lines across a hand-drawn map of the property. She looked up as he entered, but did not seem surprised by the concern written across his face. "The ground is changing," he said. She nodded gently. "Yes." He waited for more, but she simply studied the map again. "How did you know?" he finally asked. Nayeli rested one small stone near the faded creek bed. "The birds knew first." Elias sighed, rubbing the dust from his hands. "I cannot fix a ranch by watching birds." "No," she answered quietly, "but you can lose one by ignoring them." Her words stayed with him long after darkness settled outside the windows. The following 3 days tested every bit of patience he possessed. A hired ranch hand announced he was leaving to work farther east where rain had been more generous. Another neighbor rode over to say he would be selling half his cattle before the season grew worse. Even the feed merchant in town warned that prices were climbing because everyone expected a dry summer. Each conversation carried the same quiet fear. Elias counted the coins remaining inside the wooden box beneath his bed and realized they would not last forever. Every solution seemed smaller than the problem standing before him. Meanwhile, Nayeli never appeared hurried. At dawn, she walked the edges of the property, stopping beside old cottonwood trees, touching the bark, examining patches of soil between her fingers, and watching the movement of insects along fallen branches. She spoke little, yet every evening another small improvement quietly appeared. Firewood had been stacked beneath a covered lean-to before an unexpected dust storm swept through. Rain barrels had been cleaned and placed beneath every roof edge despite the cloudless sky. Even the horses seemed calmer after she rearranged their watering schedule without explaining why. Elias wanted to believe these were coincidences. They were easier to understand than the growing feeling that someone else had begun seeing his ranch more clearly than he had after living there for decades. On the 4th evening, as the last sunlight slipped behind the western ridge, Nayeli stood beside the old dry creek, and gently removed the turquoise pendant from around her neck. She held it for only a moment before looking toward the distant hills. "Tomorrow," she whispered almost to herself, "the land will ask us whether we are willing to listen." Elias followed her gaze into the fading light, unaware that the answer to that question would soon determine far more than the future of his ranch. The following sunrise arrived without a single cloud, yet the air felt strangely different. Elias stepped onto the porch expecting another dry and ordinary morning, but he immediately noticed Nayeli already walking toward the abandoned creek bed with a shovel resting across one shoulder and a bundle of willow branches tied neatly with leather cord. Curiosity finally outweighed his pride. Without saying a word, he followed her across the brittle pasture where every blade of grass crackled beneath their boots. When they reached the shallow depression that had once carried clear mountain water, Nayeli knelt and pressed both hands into the dusty earth. She closed her eyes only for a moment before scooping up a handful of soil. "Feel this," she said. Elias crouched beside her and rubbed the dirt between his fingers. The surface was dry, but beneath it remained cool. "There is still moisture," she whispered. "It is hiding." Elias frowned. "If there is water, why has nothing grown here for years?" Nayeli smiled gently as she planted one of the willow branches into the ground. "Because the land remembers the old path. People forgot it first." She asked him to help dig several narrow channels stretching no more than 20 feet from the forgotten creek toward a lower section of pasture. The work seemed pointless. By noon, sweat soaked through Elias's shirt, dust covered his boots, and nothing had changed except the growing pile of loose earth beside them. More than once he considered putting down the shovel and returning to familiar chores. Yet every time he looked toward Nayeli, she continued working with calm determination, never rushing, never doubting. As the afternoon passed, she directed him to move several large stones that had rested undisturbed for decades. Elias complained that they served no purpose. She only answered, "Sometimes the smallest wall tells water where it is welcome." Together they finished just before sunset. The dry channels looked unimpressive, little more than uneven lines scratched across exhausted ground. Elias leaned on his shovel and forced a tired laugh. "I hope you are right." Nayeli brushed the dust from her hands. "I hope the land is willing to forgive us." That evening a gentle breeze drifted through the open kitchen window, carrying the scent of distant moisture that Elias could barely recognize after so many dry weeks. Before dawn the next morning, he woke to an unfamiliar sound. It was faint at first, almost too quiet to notice. A slow trickle. He hurried outside and followed the sound toward the old creek. Overnight, a small spring had begun seeping through the hillside, no wider than a man's boot, but enough for the narrow channels they had dug to guide the water into the lower pasture instead of letting it disappear beneath loose gravel. It was not a river. It was not even enough to celebrate. Yet tiny pools had already begun forming where the thirsty grass had nearly surrendered. Elias stood speechless while morning light shimmered across the shallow water. "This cannot be a coincidence," he murmured. Nayeli looked toward the hills where the first rays of sunlight touched the cottonwood leaves. "No," she answered softly. "It is patience." Over the following days, she continued making quiet changes. She mixed herbs into the horses' feed that eased their weariness during the heat. She showed Elias how to rotate the grazing fields before the grass became exhausted. She planted hardy native plants along the creek bank to protect the fragile soil from washing away after future rains. One improvement led naturally to another until the ranch slowly began breathing again. Elias realized something that unsettled him far more than the drought ever had. Every lesson she shared felt ancient, practical, and astonishingly simple. The ranch was recovering not because of luck, but because someone had finally taught him to stop forcing the land to obey and start listening to what it had been saying all along. Within 2 weeks, the ranch looked different in ways that only patient eyes could appreciate. The grass surrounding the restored channels carried a deeper shade of green. The horses drank more calmly instead of crowding every trough, and even the old windmill seemed to turn with less strain as steady moisture slowly returned to the soil. Neighbors passing along the county road began slowing their wagons to stare across the fence, wondering how one of the driest ranches in the valley had managed to recover while others continued struggling beneath the same relentless sun. Elias worked harder than ever, Yet for the first time in years his labor felt as though it was moving with the land instead of against it. Every evening, he found himself asking Nayeli another question. Sometimes it was about plants that grew only near hidden water. Sometimes it was about the habits of migrating birds. Sometimes it was simply why she always paused before making even the smallest decision. She never answered quickly. She would study the hills, listen to the breeze moving through cottonwood leaves, then speak only after the silence had done most of the explaining. One bright afternoon, the sound of approaching wagons echoed across the valley. 3 well-dressed traders stopped outside the ranch carrying ledgers, fabric samples, and supplies they hoped to sell before traveling farther west. Elias welcomed them inside for cool water, while Nayeli quietly prepared fresh coffee over the stove. One gray-haired merchant accepted the cup, thanked her politely, then froze as his eyes settled upon the turquoise pendant resting against her neck. His expression changed so suddenly that the room itself seemed to grow still. He carefully placed his cup on the table and removed his hat without taking his eyes from the pendant. The other 2 men immediately followed his example. Elias looked from one face to another in complete confusion. "Is something wrong?" he asked. The oldest trader slowly shook his head. "No, Mr. Carter. Quite the opposite." He turned respectfully toward Nayeli. "I did not expect to see the keeper's pendant again." Elias frowned. "The what?" The merchant looked surprised that the question had even been asked. "You truly do not know?" Nayeli lowered her eyes, but remained silent. The trader continued in a quieter voice. "Years ago, an entire Apache community survived a terrible season because one young woman discovered hidden springs after every other source had failed. She refused gifts, refused payment, and asked only that the knowledge be shared with every family willing to protect the land instead of taking from it. The elders presented her with that pendant. It is not jewelry. It is an honor very few have ever received." Elias slowly turned toward his wife. Memories rushed together with startling clarity. The birds, the dry creek, the channels, the herbs, the horses. Every quiet decision that had seemed like luck suddenly carried the weight of years of wisdom. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked softly after the traders departed. Nayeli rested one hand against the weathered kitchen table where sunlight spilled through the window. "Because if I had introduced myself with a title, you might have listened to the title instead of the truth." Elias looked at the pendant shining gently against the simple fabric of her dress. For the first time since their marriage began, he realized the woman standing beside him had never entered his life searching for admiration. She had entered carrying knowledge that could not be measured by money or reputation, and somehow the greatest treasure on his ranch had never been hidden beneath the soil. It had quietly walked through his front door on the afternoon he thought he understood exactly what his future would look like. News traveled across the valley faster than rain ever could. Within another week, strangers began finding excuses to ride past the Carter Ranch, slowing their horses just long enough to study the greener fields, the healthier cattle, and the quiet confidence that now surrounded a place many had already considered lost. Not everyone admired what they saw. One warm afternoon, a polished carriage rolled through the front gate, carrying a well-known land investor named Horace Whitmore, a man whose wealth had been built by purchasing struggling ranches before desperate owners had any choice but to sell. His boots carried almost no dust, and his smile seemed carefully measured, never reaching his eyes. He complimented the fences, praised the recovering pasture, and accepted a glass of cool water before finally revealing the reason for his visit. "Mr. Carter," he said while unfolding a leather folder across the kitchen table, "I believe your future could become much easier." Elias listened politely as Horace described generous offers, profitable partnerships, and new opportunities waiting just beyond the horizon. Then the conversation quietly shifted. "There is only one concern," Horace continued in a softer voice. "Some buyers are uncomfortable with unusual arrangements. They prefer familiar faces representing neighboring ranches." Elias understood exactly what he meant without hearing Nayeli's name spoken aloud. Horace slid another document across the table. "Separate your household. Allow your wife to return to her own people. Sign this agreement, and every remaining debt on your property disappears. I will also guarantee enough capital to double your herd before winter." The room fell completely silent except for the gentle ticking of the old wall clock. Outside, a breeze carried the scent of fresh grass through the open window. Nayeli stood near the stove preparing bread, her expression unchanged as though she had heard similar words many times before. She neither defended herself nor interrupted the conversation. She simply continued kneading the dough with calm, steady hands. Elias looked from the contract to the woman who had quietly restored life to land everyone else had abandoned. He remembered the forgotten creek, the birds, the patient lessons, and the countless mornings she had risen before dawn asking for nothing in return. Yet another thought troubled him. If she left, she would be welcomed elsewhere. She had knowledge, respect, and people who understood her worth. He was the one who stood to lose everything. Horace mistook his silence for hesitation and smiled confidently. You are a practical man, Mr. Carter. This is business. The future often requires difficult choices. Before Elias could answer, Nayeli gently wiped the flour from her hands and stepped onto the porch. She looked toward the distant hills glowing beneath the afternoon sun. After a few quiet moments, Elias followed her outside. If you wish me to leave, she said softly without looking at him, I will carry no anger. A promise only has value when both hearts choose it freely. Her words settled heavily between them. She offered him freedom at the very moment everyone else expected her to fight for a place she had already earned. Elias looked across the recovering ranch where fresh green shoots now followed the winding channels they had dug together. Every fence, every horse, every tree seemed to carry her quiet fingerprints. He suddenly realized Horace had misunderstood the value of the property standing before him. The richest thing on this ranch had never been the land. It had always been the character of the woman willing to walk away rather than force someone else to stay. Horace Whitmore waited with the confidence of a man who believed every decision could eventually be measured in dollars. He stood beside his polished carriage, lightly tapping the folded contract against his palm while the afternoon breeze stirred dust across the yard. Elias remained silent for several moments, looking not at the papers but across the ranch itself. The narrow channels carrying fresh water glimmered beneath the sun. Horses grazed peacefully where only weeks before the grass had nearly vanished. The old cottonwood trees moved gently in the wind as if they had finally found something worth singing about again. Then he turned toward Nayeli. She was still standing quietly on the porch, her turquoise pendant catching a narrow beam of light. There was no expectation in her eyes, no plea for him to choose one path over another. She had offered him complete freedom, trusting his heart more than any promise written on paper. Elias suddenly understood that this was the first time in his life anyone had loved him without trying to possess him. He walked back toward Horace and accepted the contract with steady hands. The investor smiled, already believing the negotiation had been won. Elias carefully unfolded each page, read every line without rushing, then looked directly into Horace's eyes. You are right about one thing, he said calmly. The future does require difficult choices. Horace nodded with quiet satisfaction. Then we understand one another. Elias folded the papers once more before handing them back untouched. No, he replied. We do not. Horace's smile slowly faded. You are refusing an opportunity that could make you one of the wealthiest ranchers in this county. Elias glanced toward Nayeli before answering. I almost lost something far more valuable because I was too blind to recognize it. The investor shook his head in disbelief. You would choose sentiment over prosperity? Elias smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in many years. I am choosing the person who taught me what prosperity actually means. The conversation ended there. Horace returned the contract to his leather case, climbed into the carriage, and disappeared down the long dirt road without another word. As the sound of wagon wheels faded into the distance, an unexpected quiet settled across the ranch. Elias slowly walked back toward the porch where Nayeli still stood watching the evening light spread across the valley. He removed his hat, something he had never done except in church or at his mother's grave. I owe you an apology, he said softly. Not because other people failed to see who you are, because I almost did. Nayeli looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn since the day they met. People see only what they are ready to understand, she answered. Elias shook his head gently. Then today I finally learned to see. Without another word, he stepped beside her instead of ahead of her. They stood shoulder to shoulder facing the open land they had restored together. At that moment, two neighboring ranchers happened to ride past the property. Both slowed their horses, expecting the usual distance between the cowboy and his Apache wife. Instead, they watched Elias greet Nayeli with quiet respect before asking her opinion about where the next fence line should be built. There was no hesitation in his voice and no embarrassment in his posture. He spoke to her as an equal because that was exactly who she had always been. As the riders continued down the road, carrying the story toward every nearby town, Elias realized that nothing on the ranch had changed more completely than the man who now called it home. Seasons passed with the quiet certainty of sunrise following every long night. The Carter Ranch became known not because it was the largest in the valley or because it produced the most cattle, but because people always left it carrying something more valuable than supplies. Some carried practical advice. Others carried renewed hope. Travelers found fresh water waiting beside the front gate without being asked who they were or where they had come from. Young ranchers stopped to learn how the narrow irrigation channels worked, and Elias never claimed they had been his idea. He always pointed toward Nayeli with the same quiet respect that had slowly become part of his character. Children from neighboring homesteads often gathered beneath the wide cottonwood trees on warm afternoons, where Nayeli patiently taught them how to recognize animal tracks, how to protect young saplings, how to read the direction of the wind by watching tall grass instead of clouds. She welcomed every child the same way. It never mattered whether their family had arrived from the east, whether they had been born on the frontier, or whether they belonged to an Apache community beyond the hills. Around her, differences became lessons instead of walls. Years later, a new wooden sign appeared at the entrance to the ranch. It had been carved by Elias with careful hands during the winter evenings. Across the smooth pine boards were simple words that every traveler could read before entering the property. This land grows best where respect takes root. Many visitors paused beside the sign, smiled quietly, and continued through the gate without realizing they had already learned the most important lesson before meeting anyone who lived there. One bright autumn afternoon, after another successful harvest, several grandchildren ran laughing across the yard while horses grazed peacefully beyond the old windmill that still turned above the restored creek. The smallest child, no more than 7 years old, climbed onto the porch beside Elias and watched Nayeli teaching 2 children how to plant willow cuttings along the water's edge. "Grandpa," the little boy asked with complete innocence, "who built this ranch?" Elias looked toward the woman wearing the same turquoise pendant that had once silenced an entire train station many years before. Time had added silver to her hair, but had never dimmed the calm strength carried in her eyes. He smiled gently and rested one weathered hand upon the porch railing. "When I was younger," he said, "I believed I built this place with my hands." The boy looked toward the barns, the healthy fields, and the peaceful valley stretching toward the distant mountains. "Did you not?" Elias slowly shook his head. "My hands repaired fences and planted posts. But she taught me how to see what could not be measured." The child frowned thoughtfully. "What cannot be measured?" Elias watched Nayeli kneel beside the children, patiently guiding their small hands through the rich soil. "Trust, kindness, patience, respect. Those things do not fit inside a ledger, yet they are worth more than every acre we own." The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh earth across the porch while the restored creek continued its gentle song through the valley. Elias realized that the greatest change in his life had never been the return of water or the prosperity of the ranch. It had been the quiet transformation of his own heart. He had once expected an ordinary future and had almost overlooked an extraordinary person. In the end, the land flourished because 2 different worlds chose to listen before judging, to learn before fearing, and to walk beside one another instead of apart. Out on the frontier, where people often believed strength was measured by what a person could conquer, the Carter Ranch became lasting proof that the strongest lives are built by those who first learn to understand.